This is beginning of podcast 2, which is on slide 13. We're talking about sample critical elements here, or teaching cues for assessing the progress of a student in catching. As you can see, there are 4 grade levels there, and each critical element is developmentally appropriate for each grade level. In other words, each grade level can understand what those critical elements are at the grade level. These critical elements are usually assessed in the cognitive domain, and they're assessed in dance, gymnastics, aquatics, games, outdoor activities, and so on. Sample performance outcomes for balancing grades K through 8. You can see that the source is NASB 2004, the national standards, but our state standards, South Carolina standards, are taken from the national standards. Each of these are appropriate for the grade level that is listed in the range. And remember, as a teacher, you need to plan things so that students can learn the skills. They don't just need to be physically active or happy, busy, good. We need for them to be learning something about those skills. Then, of course, step 4 here is the most detailed part of planning, developing the daily lesson plans. A lesson plan for a day outlines what tasks and cues will be taught that day in the lessons. The lesson plans may include the class name, or the teacher's name for the class, the skill level, the proficiency level in other words, the length of lesson, the time that the lesson goes, and usually in South Carolina an elementary class goes anywhere between 30 and 45 minutes. The number of meetings per week, again in South Carolina it's either 1 or 2 times a week in elementary. The major focus or the movement concept for that particular lesson, and the sub-focus, which may be the skill theme that you're using or the skill themes that you're using. And then of course you'll have objectives. We try to have one objective for each 3 learning domains, and of course an extra cognitive objective for the academic language that we're trying to teach that day, and we'll talk about that more later. The students do need to learn skills. They don't need to be just physically active in the class. Being physically active is good, and you do want to have them to be physically active as much as possible, but we don't want them to just be happy, busy, good without learning something. In step 4, there are some other lesson plan components, the task development, and again we talk about the 2 different types of tasks when we create our lessons: the instructional task, or the cognitive concepts that the teacher's trying to get the students to learn, and the practice task, which is the physical organization and physical drills or activities or explorations in elementary that students do to try to learn about the movement concepts and the skill themes. The cues are refinements. Again, they're teaching cues, and they're usually very short. They remind the students how to stay focused on what it is they're trying to do in that particular task. Challenges or applications are extensions up or down, and they're goals for students to try to achieve during the lesson. Then of course there's the content, the lesson objectives, which are in 3 learning domains: psychomotor, cognitive, or affective, and the way you can tell is by looking at the behavioral verb to see what that verb is describing. And then the most important part of the lesson probably is the organization, the management, and the safety of the lesson. In this part, you need to find out or decide whether students are going to be practicing in pairs, in a square, on a circle, in general space, in groups of 3, by themselves, and also the organization is made up of several transitions that are between tasks in your lesson. In other words, how do you move them from the first task, practicing in pairs, to the second task, which is practicing in groups of 3, and how are you going to form those groups, and how quickly can you move them from one task to the other. One thing that's not listed here that's very important is the equipment. You also need to put down what the equipment is that you need for that day and make sure you have enough. In addition, you need to plan for more tasks than you think are going to be needed. In other words, most elementary classes can get to about 3 to 4 tasks in a 30-minute period. But it depends also on how well behaved those students are and how organized the teacher is. So it's important you can get more content to the students if the students are well behaved and you are very well prepared and organized. Another thing that is missing here is the introduction to the lesson, which gets the students motivated and focused for the lesson, and also the closure, which is a review of what happened in the lesson and making sure through assessments that the students have learned what you'd like them to learn. You always provide for a progression in your lessons, and how fast or how slow you move through those progressions is dependent on the student responses and how well they get what it is that you're trying to teach them. We also have a column on the lesson plan for extensions, which helps us to differentiate instruction. We adjust the activities so that we make activities that will be taught either easier, extensions down, or harder, extensions up, according to the ability of the children. Usually extensions are referring to how you would extend the task for the whole class. However, differentiating instruction is usually taking an individual and trying to modify the task just for them so that they can get either easier or harder content. These examples of tasks for throwing and catching at the elementary level are important to look at. These tasks are trying to ask students to do certain things with throwing and catching, but they're trying to get them to experiment with different areas on the floor, general space, personal space, different levels that you might be catching the ball or the scarf on, and so on. Task 1 on this slide assumes that there was a task before this. This time you're going to throw at targets. You'll have to keep your eyes on the target. Each of you has a target in your own space. See how often you can hit it. And an assessment for that particular task is that you could have them write on a wall chart how many times they hit the target, and that way you would know whether you've reached your objectives or not. Second task here is when you can hit your target 3 times in a row, take a giant step backward and try from that distance. So automatically in that task right there, you can see how the teacher has made it harder because they've asked you, the student, to take a giant step backward and try from that distance. That's known as an extension up. These are the advantages of using teaching cues, which by the way need to be very short statements, no more than 3 words, so that students can identify with what you're trying to ask them to do. Cues help children become more efficient in performing a skill or a task. They provide shortcuts to learning by refining the skills. They're most effective when given one at a time. Once children have learned a cue, then you can move to another. But giving them 2 or 3 cues at one time, they're not going to be able to remember those things, or all of them. You always use cues in conjunction with congruent feedback. In other words, when you give them a cue, you always want to give them feedback about that cue. If the cue is something to do with how they hit a ball with their foot, you don't want to be giving them feedback about what their hand and arm position is. Always be careful of giving too much information to the students. These cues for overhand throwing, which are probably going to be done in a 4th or 5th grade class instead of a K2, the cues are not really needed at the pre-control level. You really have to talk to the students about exploring movements and let them decide how they're going to move. These cues for overhand throwing are important to know throughout your life. Putting your side to the target, your arm way back, some people say in a T, step with the opposite foot or step in opposition, and follow through toward your target. Challenges or applications provide motivation for the students. It gives them a goal to work toward while they're practicing. If you just tell them to go out and practice a forearm pass in volleyball and you don't give them a goal for how many times they do it, then you might have them getting into some bad behavior situations. You want to motivate the children, and the task remains the same, but the challenge is designed to motivate. The example is batting from a tee. See how many times in a row you can hit the ball without hitting the tee or missing the ball. Making planning enjoyable. You need to set aside some time each day specifically for planning, and even more important, for reflecting on your lessons, because the reflective cycle is made up of trying to find out about your students, getting some knowledge of their prior experience, designing the lesson plan. After the lesson plan is over with, reflecting on the lesson and taking that reflection and applying that to the next lesson that they have, lesson number 2. Remember that 36 weeks are in a year. That's what you have to plan for, and the physical activity for each lesson needs to be above 50% of the time, them being physically active, in moderate to vigorous physical activity. However, your safety is the number one priority for your children in your class. You are responsible for those children. Poor planning means that a teacher has not given the students goals and they are very unorganized. Most importantly, we need to have interesting lessons that are also appropriate and that provide maximum participation for every child in the class. The best participation is them all having one piece of equipment and using that piece of equipment themselves to practice. The lesson should always match the needs of the students taught. That's the end of podcast number 2 for chapter 6.